on this webinar related to what are the employment impacts of COVID-19. And the specific niche we were looking to have for this was, you've all taken proactive steps to clean up your workplace, get out the Lysol, and stagger schedules, promote some teleworking. But now, because of a stay-at-home order that's been extended, because the outbreak is spreading, budgets are tightening, as we'll talk about, and potentially for all of you, there may be a little more public scrutiny, not yet, but forthcoming, with what are all of you as local governments doing to plan for the next chapter. So on the second slide here, we've got who the presenters are. Just a couple logistics for this seminar is, one, if you have any questions, since the only two who can talk for this are Ms. Bodine and myself, feel free to utilize the chat button for the webinar. And then you can type in your questions. Now, we will do our best, but we've got obviously a tight schedule of an hour and a half to address all of your questions. But if we don't get to your question, we will do our best to follow up with all of you to address those on a more customized basis. So, of course, as two lawyers drafting this, we've got our general disclaimer that I'm sure many are familiar with. But what are we going to talk about today? First, let me step back on the topics. We want to give a lot of credit to the Coalition of Greater Minnesota City Labor and Employee Relations Committee co-chairs. That'd be City Administrator Shauna Johnson and from Wade Park, and Human Resource Director Lynn Gorski from City of Owatonna. And part of our discussion was, with the topics we want to cover, we intend to do a few of these on an ad hoc basis. So obviously we'd appreciate your feedback at the end of this. And by ad hoc, I mean, obviously things are changing so rapidly with COVID, changing so rapidly with what the government's doing, changing so rapidly with where the economy is going and where public feedback is. So here's what we're going to address in planning for the next chapter. Two things related to that. One is we'll look at the new laws, especially though we call it, it's not necessarily a law. Governor Walz did issue a second stay-at-home order, which is basically an extension of his first with one exception. Two is we'll talk about the new federal leave legislation. Then three, we'll talk about unemployment insurance benefits and the update. Now again, I know all of you have been bombarded with that, but we feel for planning for the next chapter, focusing on those three things are important. Then the second thing we'll address quickly is what's going to happen potentially economically. And of course, for all of you local governments, what happens in the economy, even though there's a lag, if things are increasing or decreasing with it, because obviously that's going to have a huge impact on where you go with your planning for the next chapter. Then we'll end it with, what are some of the primary employment actions you can look at taking, either what you have taken, as we did submit a survey for those who fill it out. We appreciate that. And we'll, after this webinar, submit that survey to all of you to fill out. But we also want to look at what do you intend to do, especially with those latter ones we'll talk about, furloughs, that is not having folks work for some temporary time, and or layoffs. Not a lot of you are there yet, but these are just things you may unfortunately have to plan for. So that's going to be a primary focus of this webinar. Then we'll quickly talk about, well, how do you implement those actions, especially with all of you in Minnesota's public sector, a heavily unionized setting. And then time permitting, which may not be, we'll do Q&As, but obviously we recommend you utilize that chat button. For most of you, it should be on the bottom center part. For me, it's highlighted in orange. So of course we have to practice what we preach. Like many of you, I'm social distancing, working remotely. And of course, in my years practicing law, I've never heard so many dog barks, children scream, and cat meows. So you may hear the first two at my new work site, multi-use facility, but hey, that's the world we're living in. So with that, there's the topics. What we're going to do is have Ms. Bodine cover the new law portion of the webinar.
Thanks, Brandon. Okay, so moving on, as you can tell from the list of topics, the webinar really is focusing on employment actions. But before we can get to employment actions, as Brandon mentioned, there are new laws and the order from Governor Walz in place, and a lot of that information is going to be incorporated into the employment action section. So to cover this information first quickly, again, new laws, the stay-at-home order, and an update to the unemployment insurance, both at the federal and state level. We'll cover those topics first. So a quick overview of how did we get here? So rationale for issuing the stay-at-home order and extending it is as of the 8th, so yesterday, Minnesota had 1,154 confirmed COVID-19 cases and 271 hospitalizations, 39 fatalities. In the US in total, and this number is from 2 days ago, had over 374,000 confirmed cases and over 12,000 recorded fatalities. So this again comes with the caveat that, and we've heard this likely numerous times by now, but increased testing capacity would likely show that COVID-19 is circulating in communities across Minnesota that have not yet identified a confirmed case, but because we don't necessarily have that testing capacity, those just have not been confirmed. And on the 29th, the federal government revised previous guidance and encouraged continued social distancing through the end of April, which in part plays into this extended order. And then finally, as of the 7th, 41 other states, which represents almost 318 million Americans, have issued orders or public health directives, closing non-essential businesses or limiting residents from participating in non-essential activities. So again, this second stay-at-home order is really an extension of the first. So the original executive order was issued on March 25th, and this extension that was put in place yesterday goes through Sunday, May 3rd at 11:59 p.m. What hasn't changed is that this means that individuals are not permitted to leave residences for work unless that individual is a critical sector worker and also is performing work that can only be done at his or her place of work. So meaning that that work cannot be done from home. And this also includes if that individual is traveling to and from their work, including to and from childcare. As I mentioned, so regardless of whether someone is considered a critical sector worker or not, they are still encouraged to work from home or telework if possible. So even if someone is identified as a critical sector worker, if they can do their job from home, that is the expectation at this point and is encouraged. So getting to who is a critical sector worker, if you've seen the order, or the extended order, the second issued, you'll know that that contains a long list detailing which employees are critical sector workers. And attached to that order, both the initial stay-at-home order and the extended is a document that is the Essential Critical Infrastructure Workforce, or CISA guidance, issued, put together by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And that document was updated on, I believe, March 28th. And so the updated CISA guidance was attached to the new order. So the guidance is largely similar in many respects, but there's also numerous sectors where that guidance expanded upon and clarified. So if you're interested to see whether the sector you're working in or different departments that you have may have had some added clarification as to who is a critical sector worker, I recommend looking at that the new order that was issued yesterday. So where you can see that updated size of guidance. And amongst that is the following. You can see the addition to that update to the critical sector workers. So this includes workers supporting minimum basic operations in businesses and other organizations, including minimum necessary activities to maintain the value of the business's inventory, preserve the condition of a business or other organization's facilities, physical plant or equipment, ensure security, process payroll, and employee benefits or related functions. So we took that piece out and highlighted it because that is potentially relevant to a number of the entities who are tuning in to listen to this webinar today. Again, this portion hasn't changed, but what's required of employers with this executive order is that critical sector workers should still be adhering to the extent possible, Minnesota occupational safety and health standards, along with the Minnesota Department of Health and CDC guidelines related to COVID-19. We've all heard social distancing many times by now, and what employers can be doing to ensure that they are adhering to hygiene guidance as well. And one thing that has changed since the initial guidelines from the CDC were released is that the CDC is now recommending that cloth face coverings are used in public settings, especially in areas where there's significant community-based transmission. So with that added caveat, it's possible that employers are having employees ask about whether they can use cloth face coverings or other coverings, depending on if, for example, you'd have first responders who might be using something other than cloth face coverings that are, more readily available and not reserved for those individuals who are either medical first responders or healthcare workers. So just because you might be getting those questions, you should be prepared to think about whether that's something that you're going to provide for employees or require, depending on the types of employees, the positions that they're working in. In addition to what's required from the health workplace safety perspective, it's also recommended that employers document who their critical sector workers are, who those non-essential workers are, both names, job titles, and then in addition to that, thinking through what critical sector work those individuals are performing, and as an entity, what critical sector work you have. This may be more relevant to larger workforces who, it would help to have a list of who those individuals will be, but also just as the process of doing that due diligence to make sure that you've really thought through who those individuals are and what type of work they're doing. Moving on to the federal leave laws. So the first federal leave law I'll cover is the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So we'll refer to this throughout the PowerPoint, and when Brandon starts discussing employment actions, it'll be referred to as EPSL. So just so everyone has a baseline for what is required and what this leave, what that grants to eligible employees. So this leave applies to nearly all public employers and covered employees under this act. So unlike the expanded family and medical leave, all employees are potentially eligible for emergency paid sick leave, meaning there's no minimum number of hours or duration before which that employee becomes eligible. However, with the caveat that employers may exclude employees who are either healthcare providers or emergency responders. And the Act has provided a pretty specific definition of who is considered a healthcare provider or emergency responders, which I haven't included that just for sake of time, but that has been that has been defined. And if there's any questions as to whether an employee that you have might fall under either of those categories, I think for many cities, who is an emergency responder isn't necessarily as complicated as it may be for other entities. But again, we're available to answer any of those questions. So if an employee is looking to take emergency paid sick leave, and it's for any of the reasons that are listed on this slide, that employee would be compensated at their regular rate if they are unable to work. So these reasons would be whether that individual is quarantined pursuant to federal, state, or local government order, quarantined pursuant to healthcare advisement, or experiencing COVID-19 symptoms. So again, for those reasons, an employee would be compensated at their regular rate if they're unable to work. And that is subject to limitations that the employee cannot be compensated for more than $511 per day or $5,110 in total for the emergency paid sick leave taken for these reasons. And there are other reasons why an employee may be able to take emergency paid sick leave, and they are entitled to that for these additional reasons on this slide, which are related more so to caring for an individual quarantined. So not that the employee is quarantined themselves as on the previous slide, but caring for someone quarantined pursuant to federal, state, local government order, caring for minor child whose care provider or school is unavailable due to COVID-19, or experiencing a substantially similar condition as specified by either of these entities, the Secretary of Health, in consultation with the Secretaries of Treasury and Labor at the federal level. So for those reasons, an employee would be compensated at 2/3 of their regular rate if they are unable to work, as opposed to their regular rate. And similarly to the previous slide, there is also a cap on how much an employee can be compensated. So that's $200 per day or $2,000 in total for these specified reasons. And then finally, this is a question that we've gotten at least a few times now, but an employee can use, they may use accrued sick time, vacation days, or PTO to supplement payment for the 1/3 of their wage that they're not being paid. So again, if there's specific questions about how that would work exactly, we're available to answer that, but that is generally a question we've gotten. So just want to clarify where that's applicable, and this is one of those circumstances. So to get to the length of leave, full-time employees, generally that would be employees working at least 40 hours or more a week. Those employees may take up to 80 hours of EPSL, whereas regular part-time employees may take up to the number of hours they average over a 2-week period. Doing this math isn't as complicated for someone who has a regular schedule. However, there are guidelines that have been expanded upon. Guidance has been issued through the temporary rule, which now is online, and you can look through some of those examples of how this would work with employees who aren't on necessarily a regular schedule. But for irregular employees, if they work 6 months or more, you would look at the average hours over a 6-month period to determine the amount of leave available. And if that employee has worked for less than 6 months, it would be the hours that they would be expected to work. And this is also a question that we have gotten, and so I wanted to address that here before we get into the employment action section. But employers can prohibit intermittent leave, so that should be, if that is allowed, it would be through an agreement between the employer and employee. And the guidance from the Department of Labor has expanded upon when intermittent leave would not be appropriate, considering this is COVID-19 is communicable. There are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want an employee to be taking that leave intermittently. And that, again, has been clarified since the initial guidance and order was issued. And getting to whether the stay-at-home order is a state quarantine or isolation order that allows employees to use EPSL. So if you've been looking into this because this is something you were wondering when the first order came out, this is something that has, regardless of where you were looking for information, has changed at least twice since the initial guidance was put out. But most recently, the Department of Labor has clarified that the stay-at-home order is considered a quarantine or isolation order for purposes of administering the emergency paid sick leave. So initially, it was thought that it may apply. Employers should likely err towards allowing for EPSL to be used for that purpose. That transition to it was determined that a state quarantine or isolation order needed to be something more than just a stay-at-home order. And finally, this temporary rule that was published on April 6th through the Department of Labor made it very clear that a stay-at-home order, or for other states that might have that worded a little bit differently, but that does allow employees to use EPSL. So looking at, again, the stay-at-home order and EPSL, the Department of Labor has clarified that an employee subject to stay-at-home order may not use EPSL where the employer does not have work for the employee. So you can think of it as, but for the stay-at-home order, the employee would be able to work. So if the employee is unable to work, if they are unable to work, but for the stay-at-home order, that would be an indication that they are able to use EPSL. But for example, if an employer closes a work site because they lack business or they were required to close pursuant to federal, state, or local directive, the employee there, they wouldn't be able to work even if they were not required to comply. So that would not kick in this EPSL. And just to add to that, those employees may still be eligible for unemployment insurance, but just not for the emergency paid sick leave. Moving on to expanded family and medical leaves, EFML, as we'll refer to it throughout the rest of the presentation. So this again covers nearly all public employers, but to contrast this from the EPSL, employees have to have been employed for at least 30 days, whereas with the EPSL, there was no specified number of days an employee needed to be working for the employer. So 30 days here. And as with emergency paid sick leave, again, employers may exclude employees who are either healthcare providers or emergency responders. So length of leave, full-time employees can take up to 12 weeks of EFML, and part-time employees may take up to the number of hours they average over a 12-week period in addition to EPSL. So with this expanded family and medical leave, expansion to FMLA, the first 10 days of EFML an employee takes may be unpaid. This has been clarified slightly that this really should read that it's the first 2 weeks of EFML that an employee takes may be unpaid. And for many employees, that distinction isn't relevant. But again, it's for those employees who are part-time or on a irregular schedule that 10 days versus 2 weeks distinction is relevant here. So again, you should really think of that as 2 weeks. But an employee may elect to use accrued sick time, vacation days, PTO, or EPSL to to be paid for those initial 2 weeks that otherwise would be taken unpaid. Okay, so when is this available? Again, this is EFML is an expansion to FMLA, but specifically, this can only be utilized if an employee is unable to work because they are caring for his or her minor child whose care provider or school is unavailable due to COVID-19. So it is for this reason only. It's possible that an employee is eligible for both. But if you look back at when an employee may be able to use emergency paid sick leave, there are obviously numerous other reasons why they might have that leave available, but the EFML would not apply to those employees. So an employee can use this leave and be compensated at 2/3 of their regular rate for this reason. And there are, again, limitations that an employee cannot be compensated for more than $200 per day or $10,000 in total. And if an employee is taking both the emergency paid sick leave and this EFML, the total compensation they may receive is $12,000 over a 12-week period. So a cap on both of those taken together. And again, an employee may use or an employer may require accrued sick time, vacation days, or PTO to supplement payment for the third of their wage that an employee is not being paid. We're getting to documentation of need for leave. So this was a more recent addition to guidance from the Department of Labor, but the Department of Labor has clarified that EPSL or EFML, to take that leave, an employer can require employees to follow reasonable notice procedures as soon as practical, including a written statement, which may be after the first workday or portion of a workday for which an employee receives paid sick leave in order to continue to receive such leave. So, and then below, you can see what that signed statement would contain, which is the name, dates for which leave is requested, the coronavirus qualifying reason for leave, and in addition to that, a statement that the employee cannot work or telework because of this reason. And just to add to that, so obviously, and this has been stated as guidance from the Department of Labor as well, but there are a lot of reasons why an employee may not be able to get documentation from a healthcare provider right away, given that they are very busy at the moment, and that just might not be something that they are able to get as quickly as they would under normal circumstances. So the guidance has really asked that employers consider being more flexible with that. That is an expectation, is that there's a little more flexibility given there in terms of how that is provided. But again, it is still something employers can require. It's just having a little bit of flexibility with when that documentation is provided. So because the expanded EFML refers to if an employee is caring for a child unable to work because they're caring for that child because of school or child care provider closure, the normal FMLA certification rules still apply if an employee is dealing with their own serious health condition. So, it's reading in addition to, as I said, it's an expansion to FMLA, but that's still, the normal FMLA requirements are still in place. And if an employee does fail to give proper notice, employers should give the employee notice of that failure to give proper notice and provide the employee with an opportunity to provide required documentation prior to denying the request for leave. So again, trying to remain flexible given the current circumstances. So looking at return to work, so in most circumstances, an employee is entitled to be restored to their same or equivalent position. This is job protected leave. So upon returning from taking EPSL or EFML, given that it's job protected, the FMLA job restoration provisions are still applicable for EFML. So if you're familiar with those provisions, they are similar here. But again, if to the extent that there are any minor differences, that guidance has been issued. But generally, it's expected that an employee be restored to their same or equivalent position that they would have been returned to after coming back from FMLA leave. However, and this also is similar to FMLA, but this does not protect an employee from employment action such as a layoff that would have affected the employee regardless of whether leave was taken. So with this, an employer does have the burden of proof to show that an employee would not otherwise have been employed at the time reinstatement is requested in order to deny restoration to employment. So the employer has to demonstrate that the employee would have been laid off even if they had not taken leave. And moving on to the unemployment insurance update before turning it over to Brandon. So both the federal and the Minnesota unemployment insurance programs have temporarily changed a number of their rules for employee eligibility, benefit levels and lengths, and employer responsibilities. So the general rules of eligibility still apply, although some of those have changed. So if you're not familiar with some of those general eligibility rules, I'll cover on a few of them throughout going through this section, but just to keep in mind, this is really meant to be an update rather than going through eligibility requirements in general. So under the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, or the CARES Act, again, this is the federal act that is providing for increased unemployment benefits. And Minnesota at this point has implemented some of the provisions that came out of this CARES Act, not all of them, but as of a couple of days ago, some of those provisions, which I will get to in just a moment, Minnesota has provided guidance on that was not available up until just a couple of days ago. So specific changes with the federal CARES Act. So this provides that there is available weekly unemployment benefits of up to $600 in addition to state benefit amounts. So typically an employee would be able to, if eligible, have 50% of their wages paid up to a maximum, this is set by the state, of $740. So in addition to that, there's the $600 in addition through July 31st of 2020. And then on top of that, there's an additional 13 weeks of $600 payments for those individuals who do exhaust state unemployment benefits. So typically there's a 26-week period that is the benefit time frame, but this extends that to 39 weeks with these $600 payments if an employee has exhausted their state benefits. And then finally, and this is more nuanced, but the eligibility generally has been expanded to include independent contractors, part-time workers, and new hires who generally under state laws may have not had sufficient work history to be eligible for unemployment. But this eligibility has also been expanded. Just to summarize these next two slides, because I think it can be summed up, and I will get into this a little bit with the Minnesota specific changes, but there is expanded eligibility under the CARES Act for unemployment insurance if it is due to the inability to work is due to a COVID-19 reason. So All of these reasons are related to COVID-19. Generally, I mean, it's fairly broad. If you read through these, again, I won't go through them one by one, but because this has come up previously, what this does not mean is that someone is not eligible simply because they have a general fear of contracting COVID-19. So if that person isn't susceptible for underlying health reasons for which their healthcare provider has advised that they abide by different guidelines, for example, if someone's just generally afraid of going to work, that doesn't make them eligible. This also includes if someone can telework with pay, this expansion doesn't make them eligible. In addition to those who are already receiving paid leave under an employer plan or policy or applicable federal, state, and local law. It also does not state that a person would be eligible who is a new entrant to the workforce who cannot find unemployment. So that has not changed. So getting to the Minnesota specifics. So with Governor Walz's executive order related to unemployment insurance, there have been at least 2 or 3 now, but this executive order 20-05 is what suspended the strict compliance with Minnesota's unemployment insurance law. So where that expansion is really relevant is 3 areas. So typically there is a waiting week for workers who are looking to receive unemployment insurance, but due to this executive order, workers do not have to wait that week to become eligible. So no waiting week currently. Also, workers do not have to take or keep a job that puts their health or safety at risk. Typically, eligibility includes actively seeking work and being able and available to work. So this just clarifies that if taking or keeping a job would put that individual at risk, they are not required to do that. That would not make them ineligible. And then finally, workers who take leave of absence because of health reasons have more access to benefits. So just to elaborate on that, there's leaves of absences are presumed involuntary. So again, this expands on what is generally considered an eligibility requirement, but this order has just clarified what is presumed involuntary. So these are all generally related to COVID-19 reasons. Some of them track pretty closely with the federal guidance that we went through just a moment ago on the previous slide. So I won't go through these specifically, but again, this provides that when leaves of absences would be presumed involuntary at this time. Okay, and then because this plays in directly to what Brandon will be discussing in just a moment, we have had a lot of questions on this come up from those entities that we work with, and where this has significant impact on employers and in particular local governments and other government entities is that employers, there's 2 options generally for paying into the UI trust fund. So employers are either tax-paying employers, paying through taxes, or they are reimbursing employers. So they are reimbursing for those unemployment benefits paid to former employees. So to elaborate on that, so with these changes related specifically to COVID-19, so those employers who pay into the UI trust fund as tax-paying employers, they are not going to have their experience rating or that applicable tax rate changed due to this expansion. If someone is claiming unemployment for COVID-specific reasons, that relief has been provided to tax-paying employers that would not have an impact on their experience rating. However, There's no relief currently for reimbursing employers, which is generally, political subdivisions, cities, government entities who are otherwise reimbursing employers as opposed to taxing employers. And again, so this does mean that public employers are subject to paying up to 26 weeks of 50% generally of an employee's weekly wage, subject to that weekly maximum. And this would have to be reimbursed. So given that the reasons for being found eligible to receive unemployment benefits has been expanded significantly, at least at this time, this could and may likely have a significant impact on political subdivisions, cities, a lot of entities that we work with. So I did want to highlight this. We've had a lot of questions, and of course, if this does change and there is additional relief provided, we will be tracking that pretty closely. Okay, and then with that, I will turn things over to Brandon to talk about first the economy and then moving into specific employment actions.
All right, thank you, Chelsea. So now we're going to segue to, what's happening with the economy. And obviously this changes by the day and almost by the minute. But one thing, one credible source that we've seen is, the conference board. And I'm sorry, just a moment, my PowerPoint's frozen. All right, there we go. So again, we've all read different analysis. I will say this, that I think we're going to know a lot more tomorrow as we end this economy portion on where the economy is going and potentially where the state budget is going when Minnesota Management and Budget puts out one of their monthly economic updates. Then on top of that, within a couple weeks, they're going to put out some more full analysis on where the budget's at in light of the economy. But as of today, which is going to be out of date tomorrow, once you get that update, I think the conference board, which is more of a think tank, more business driven, but I think they summarized it well. What do they see as 3 scenarios that could happen here, which will impact all of you in planning and obviously primarily your budget on this piece? One is, in an ideal world, or not ideal, but sort of their middle range, more realistic world, they think with all these social distancing efforts, if they flatten the curve, a term we're used to hearing throughout the next 2 to 3 months, which means we're not going to eviscerate COVID within a month, but 2 to 3 months will start to be at the back end of that curve. The problem with social distancing is they articulate well, that may be a bigger impact on the economy to flatten the curve, because what that does is it extends the time frame of the economy, and 2, it impacts more sectors. So the more social distancing you all have, which is good public health practice, the more sectors, the more employees are going to be implicated, and their hours are going to be reduced and or potential layoffs. So they predict, I think, which could be accurate, that growth may come back in the fall, and therefore by the time we get to the end of the year, the 4th quarter, things may start to uptick. But again, they still think by the end of the year, we'll have a 15% unemployment rate, which is unprecedented. And 2 is the economy would shrink by about 6%, which would be the largest decline in the economy since 1946 when we were coming out of World War II. So again, those aren't numbers we saw in the Great Recession. The problem with the Great Recession is more protracted. The problem with this, it could be shorter, but it's going to be more severe, more damaging, and look more like the Great Depression than it does the Great Recession. So that's what their more realistic world is. On the other hand, their concern is that a higher number of people are going to be infected, and we may not hit the peak on infection rates until sometime in May. Then they say the economy is going to contract, that is, decrease on a much more intense level during the 2nd quarter, which starts now here in April. But they do think by the time the 3rd quarter hits, maybe there's a rebound. But again, they still predict the economy would fall by about 5.5%. Again, unemployment at 15% or more, potentially in the 20% range, but then unemployment will start to whittle down at the end of the year. But their concern, even with this scenario, is that by the time we get back to the fall, especially in Minnesota, even if we've done our job and things are mitigated during the summertime, things may start to resurge in the fall, which again, all of you, when you plan, you got to think about this. We're not going to be out of the weeds in May or June when, schools are still obviously closed, social distancing has taken effect, but maybe more people are coming back to work, but we could see an uptick in the fall. But then 3 is their best case, which is unlikely, and they admit it, by the time we get to the middle of this month, things are going to start to be in the downslide of the virus. We'll get a quicker reboot in the economy. But again, they say, the epidemiological data says no way is this going to happen. Even if it is remote, we're still going to see 10% unemployment during this quarter. And they already project, and I just saw this morning, unemployment came out, will be at 10%. So that's the unlikely, most optimistic viewpoint, but the most unlikely. So again, what are we going to find out more tomorrow is when MMB is going to put out their update, and then there'll be more detailed analysis on the budget. So now we'll get to what are employers doing. And one thing we did is we distributed a survey, which you all should have received, as we wait for my computer to think about things. So though it's unofficial and interim, what do? We surveyed entities. For those who haven't received it, we'll follow up with everybody. About 70% of respondents are cities, 22% municipal utilities, about 8% counties. So what are entities doing now? First, if we look at who is doing telework, as we wait for that slide to come up. There we go. So who is allowing telework? For clerical, interestingly, you've got about 80% of responding entities doing it. 70% are doing the financial world, management supervisors, which we actually see more prevalent, 73%. We're just not seeing, obviously, for a lot of your frontline workers, it's not going to be workable. But then this gives you a flavor. Bottom line, we still have 88% for the largest employee group of you, just about 100% allowing clerical workers to do some level of remote work. We'll talk about how you should handle that. Then the second option is, basically cross-training and having employees do things in other jobs. Not many are doing that, especially though with managements and supervisors, we are seeing that more. You're having them do some more level of rank and file work when your rank and file employees are either working reduced schedules, not working at all, or working remotely. Some of you, surprisingly, there are some furloughs already happening, which again, just to define that, that's basically a short interim period of time where an employee isn't doing any work for the employer. And again, this is not even working remotely. So about half of you are doing that for clerical workers, about half doing it for park and rec. And then of course, libraries on the city county level, we're seeing that at a rate of half. So again, we already seen some furloughs, but again, it's primarily in the administrative, the clerical, park and rec, of course, which makes sense with programming and library. But if and when we're going to see it in public works and public safety, it's not there yet, but maybe something folks are unfortunately considering. Hiring freezes, that is, if you've got a vacant position, you're in hiring. We're seeing a lot of that in clerical. Everybody, of course, with the evisceration of your programming, your sports, et cetera, community education, we have all of you at the park and rec level doing some form of a hiring freeze. Then we get layoffs again. We're just not seeing it yet. which we saw during the Great Recession, just because your budgets are intact for now. So again, it's just not something we're seeing a high prevalence, but something to unfortunately maybe think about. A lot of you, though surprisingly not as much as we thought, are looking at doing long-term, more non-priority tasks. We're seeing that to some level, but not at a high clip. Reducing total work hours, of course, with your county admin buildings or city halls, all your office buildings, for the most part, and for a lot of you being shuttered, about 78% of you have actually reduced work hours as a result. For clerical, next highest, of course, not surprisingly, is Park and Rec. We're seeing a little more in Public Works and a lot less in all those other groups. So again, some of you doing that staggered work schedules from our end. We're seeing a lot of that in the public safety world. Unfortunately, we missed police on this one, but we have some of it in fire, but we got clerical about 80%. So that's who's staggering schedules. Now, what do you intend to do going forward from the public employment end? One is we have, for your clerical workers, about 90% of you are allowing for remote work. Course managements and supervisors, we're seeing a lot of that. But still, a lot of you are not intending to do it just because it's not workable for the others. But this just demonstrates 9/10 of you, by the time we get to April 30, are going to have some level of remote work for clerical. Doing other jobs, of course, you've got clerical folks doing that, management supervisors. Again, these are things you intend to do. Furloughs. Again, we've got clerical workers at a much higher clip you intend to do. Park and Rec. We're seeing it for less than the majority of furloughs. That is, again, where you take employees completely out of the workforce for a short time. So again, even with the stay-at-home order, even with the economy, we're not seeing public employers do that at a high clip. Hiring freezes, we're seeing it across the board with clerical, a lot of Park and Rec from our end, and even some management and supervisory positions. So those are the three highest. We're seeing it. If you've got a vacant position, for now, you're not filling it. But again, statistically, we don't have much out there. Layoffs, again, pretty interesting. We're seeing about half of you looking at it for clerical, for those who have cities who have municipal liquor, Park and Rec. So again, we still only have half of you looking at it. Again, this is not a real statistically valid measure. It wouldn't surprise me to see a little bit of an uptick, but maybe that's where we're at. Maybe there's some more positivity that short term it's going to be tough, but we're not going to look at long-term layoffs. But again, as we get more economic projections, as we see where COVID-19 goes, maybe that's something more you're going to plan for. Doing more long-term tasks, about half you doing that. Reducing total work hours, we're still only seeing clerical having more than half you looking at that. You're still not, for many of you, except in the Park and Rec world, looking at reducing total work hours, even by the time we get to the end of April 30th. Staggered work schedules, we got half of you are going to be looking at it for a majority of your work groups. And again, we'll talk about what a staggering schedule means. It basically means you reduce the number of people in each shift, but what you do is you add shifts so that you have more shifts, but less people working each shift. So again, we're seeing a lot of that in the public safety world. Now, what are you doing on the wage benefit end? 70% of you have basically said, all right, if you're absent from work, we're going to have more liberality. So anytime you're absent, you can use sick, vacation, paid time off, et cetera. We're not going to be overly thorough and overly scouring what bank you're using. Now, for those of you who have paid time off, this is not a big deal. For those of you who have traditional vacation and sick, this is a big deal, but 70% of you are getting, for the lack of a better word, more liberal and flexible on using other leaves. And of course, all of you, or many of you, a majority, are doing it for involuntary hours. That is, if you reduce their hours because of facilities shuttering down or they're not critical sector workers, you got a little over half of you when it's an involuntary, meaning you're going from 40 to 30 or 20 hours. Over half of you are still saying, all right, for the time, if we're reducing you to 20 hours in lieu of 40, we're going to allow 20 of those hours to be made up with paid leave time. A little over half of you are doing that. Some of you, again, have established, especially we've seen this at the state of Minnesota level, much larger entities, a lot less in smaller entities. You basically established a new leave bank. So for example, the state of Minnesota for the lack of a better word, the most extreme, have basically set up this new bank while the public health emergency is in place by the governor. But a little less than half of you, so close to half, have said, all right, we're going to provide a new leave bank of hours. But again, it's still a minority, but still pushing. We're seeing a lot of that now, but I do think that we're going to see a lot less of that is either one, it becomes unaffordable, or two, you get a little more public scrutiny when maybe even your small businesses aren't paying employees 100%, especially of their pay when they're not working, especially when you've seen the expansion of the unemployment law. So we think that number could possibly go down. No one yet, again, statistically, take this with a grain of salt. We're still waiting for more responses, are doing a flat out, we're not paying you for reduction hours or furloughs. None of you are doing that yet. You at least allow them to use at a minimum paid leave, but who knows, maybe that changes. Now in the future, what are folks do? A lot of you are still going to maintain flexibility of 74%. About 2/3 of you are going to allow for use of paid leave, at least through involuntary hours, such as hours reduction or furloughs. Again, this is through April 30th. We had the stay-at-home order through May 3rd, so maybe that's more the magical date. About half of you are still looking at establishing a new COVID-19 leave bank, and a little less than half are still looking to pay employees if it's an involuntary reduction. But again, I think that number is going to start to slide a little. Now, again, statistically, not much there, though we're probably going to see maybe more of an uptick that if you're reducing hours or furloughing, maybe you're not going to allow employees to use paid leave and or pay them flat out. Again, still probably going to be the minority for Minnesota public entities, but we may see more of that. So now we've got the options, how do we execute on those? So what we're going to do is go in order of keeping people at work to what happens if you don't have people at work. So first thing, again, a lot of you have unionized employees, so this is a bigger deal. Bottom line, what's the black letter law? First, you got to consider if you're going to exercise these options we've talked about, can you just do it? Or is it something you have to meet and confer, or to the extreme, you have to meet, negotiate, and get the union's agreement before you do it? Now, again, Pell is clear. We all know it, black letter law. There are certain things you don't have to meet and negotiate over in law. And we'll talk about your contract may expand it. So specifically, what does PELRA talk about, that third bullet point? One is it's your overall budget, how you utilize technology, how you're organized, who you select to do things, and directing, and the number of personnel, which is the big deal when it comes to, for example, if you're looking at layoffs. So on its face, black letter law, that's what you have management right to do. Generally, you don't have to negotiate it. But then we get to, well, you may have contracts. Well, you have labor contracts in place with unionized employees, but what you have in your contract may either bolster your management right, or it's going to either prohibit, restrict it, or you waived your right to exercise it. So with each of these options, we'll talk more in the weeds, but again, this is your time to analyze your labor contracts. A lot of you have gotten by. For example, I'll bring up why a lot of you may have been a little passive on this, is you've taken actions, you've given notices. We haven't been proactive with the unions as much. Some of you have, I think you more so will be, but conspicuously on our end, though I think this is going to change when you start to do more, is unions have been a little more passive. For example, we've all got the AFSCME letter that basically says, hey, work with us, give us what you're doing to keep the workplace safe. Thank you for keeping employees employed. We appreciate leave flexibility. Oh, but by the way, if you're going to reduce hours, or if you're looking at furloughs, or if you're looking at layoffs, you've got to talk to us. So a lot of you received that AFSCME type letter. Or in the union front, we've seen from the Teamsters, they're saying, all right, for our first responders especially, or emergency responders, because you're having them work, thank you for doing that, but because they're more exposed than others, they're more at risk, even OSHA would say that, you're going to have to start paying them a little more in hazard pay. So we'll talk about how to deal that within each of those options. But Anecdotally, we're not hearing much from the unions filing formal grievances or threatening to take you to court, at least in a genuine manner yet. But I think that's going to change. That's part of the reason why we're going through this exercise. If you plan right, if you notice the union's right, and if you work with them to some extent, you're going to be well positioned, and you can hopefully deter a grievance or lawsuit and or position yourself better. So, what's the general analysis is that bottom line, if you've got a good faith business reason in this next slide in the balances of interest test, especially with the public health emergency, potential financial emergencies, balance that with the union right to negotiate, you're probably be in good position. Now, again, during the recession, we had arbitrators were all over the place on what you were doing, like with furloughs. You're still going to have arbitrators all over the place. So again, that's why we always have to be careful in these presentations. You're going to need customized advice, and a lot of it's going to be based on what does your labor contract say and what is your past practice. But again, we're trying to position you. If you put together a good analysis like we're recommending at the end here, we still think in any grievance or any lawsuit, you're going to be well positioned to take the actions we're going to talk about next. So what are the options? Option one, again, in the hierarchy of keeping people at work. One is, can we have them do more long-term non-priority tasks? This especially relates to your clerical folks. City halls are shuttered. County administration officers are shuttered to the public. They may run out of things to do. Payments aren't coming in quite as quickly. So again, now's the time to update your policies, your training materials, handle your data retention. That's a big deal for all of you, especially with the heightened scrutiny from the legislature, Office of Administrative Hearing, and even courts. Maybe now it's a good time to do all that stuff. Now, on the unionized setting, unless they're doing substantially different duties or higher level duties, generally you're not going to have the unions balk at you assigning and directing their work, again, because it's generally a management right. So beyond long-term tasks, we look at other duties. Now, where are we seeing it from our end? We're seeing a lot more your administrative assistants are at home, working remotely or not working at all, or reduced hours. Management, we all know, has to do more of that administrative type work. So that is where you potentially could have the union start to balk a little bit. So generally, you can do it. So much like long-term tasks, the second option you can look at, assigning other duties, like for example, supervisor to do some more field or rank and file work. Generally, you can do it, except what we need to do is we need to look at your labor agreements, because that's going to be telling. Now, thankfully, a lot of you, at least from our end, don't talk about what work employees do. So one, you should never agree to that. Two, obviously, if you have it, you're stuck with it. But three, most of you don't have that provision. So again, what do you look at? Your employer authority to assign work. Two is your management rights. And three is what the unions will rely upon is to say, look at, if we have an administrative assistant, they're listed in the bargaining unit, they try the generalized argument, therefore, only administrative assistants in our unit can do administrative work. However, again, we've got nuanced arbitration decisions, nuanced court cases on this. But again, we're back to, in general, what would a court or arbitrator look at to determine if you can assign a non-bargaining unit employee, such as a supervisor, to do bargaining unit work? What they're going to look at, again, the balancing and interest test that we use and utilize a lot. So you've got a viable defense, for example, to have a supervisor do bargaining unit work in a non-supervisory bargaining unit based on all these factors. So the more factors are prevalent, the better. And those are in the sub-bullets at the bottom. So is it just minor de minimis work? What does that mean? Look at your supervisor is only doing a half hour of administrative assistant work daily, though it's still going to be tough for the union to prove it. That's balance of interest, balances in the employer's favor. If you don't address work on the contract, like I talked about, that tips in your favor. Or there's not an exclusive practice of employees doing the work. Now, where do we see that a lot? We see that a lot in the public work sector. You've got a four-person, but hopefully you've got a supervisor as the more analogous public work supervisor. We all know on rare occasion, unless you're a big entity, a supervisor will hop in a truck, they'll do some field work that otherwise is done by the rank and file union employees. So again, if the union hasn't balked at that in the past, we still think you can keep that practice going. But where is it a problem if your public work supervisor is now spending, instead of a half hour a day on average, he's now spending his or her half of the day 4 hours a day in the truck doing public works work. That's where you see more problems. But again, in the totality, arbitrators or courts are going to look at all these factors. Is it experimental? That's really not going to be prevalent here. Has the character of the work changed? Automation or technology? But again, bottom line for all of you, it's more the public health emergency. Look at this is an emergency issue. It's not going to be long term, and it's not going to be for a full day. So we think based on the balancing of interest, you can get away with it. But again, as I told you, 50-50 world in the arbitration setting or court setting, again, our biggest example, having supervisors do non-supervisory bargaining unit work. Again, our job as part of the seminar is to position you for those arguments. Now, another argument we're seeing is on the flip. You have unionized employees maybe doing more higher level work if you've got mid-level management or supervisors busy with other things dealing with the crisis. Now, we are seeing a request, for example, from Teamsters saying, all right, our officers, police officers, are now doing higher level sergeant type work because either our sergeant's out for COVID-19 or our sergeant is too busy dealing with the public health emergency and planning for that. Now you have to pay us what's known as out of class pay. So unless it's in the contract, generally you're not going to be required to either negotiate mid-contract or just unilaterally pay them out of class pay, which you couldn't anyways. However, we need to be cognizant again. Arbitrators are split like everything, but we go back to what's the black letter law. Generally, you don't have to pay that patrol officer for doing higher level sergeant work unless it results, per El Khoury, in a material increase in the workload and it alters the basic characteristic of what they're required to do. So our argument is, well, if this is short term, it's a public health emergency, the patrol officer's not signed 8 hours a day, every shift to do sergeant work, that's not really altering the basic characteristic of their job. Therefore, we feel union, you don't have a viable argument, they should get out of class pay. But again, when does it become material? When does it become significant? We think if it's a lot more regular and a lot more frequent that, if, for example, patrol officers doing sergeant type work. Absent that, you probably are still going to have viable defenses. Now, some of you in your contract already address out of class pay. So this is not going to be rocket science for you. For example, if it says an officer assigned to do sergeant work for more than 4 hours a day will get out of class pay. So again, it's easy for you who have it in contracts. It's not as easy if you don't have your contract, but it's easy to argue as an employer, you don't have to pay that out of class pay. Now, third option, again, we've talked about giving more leave flexibility, allowing employees to use accrued paid leave, more liberally. Using paid leave not yet accrued, it's caused some angst with our governing bodies on that. Can administrators or managers do it? We argue that per local health emergency declarations, administrators or managers have some wiggle room to do it. But we always want to be clear, whatever you do with the more liberal usage, it can't be retroactive. If you make it retroactive, for example, if you issue a notice today that says you're going to allow paid leave to accrue, which is still debatable, scour your contracts, scour your charters, scour your code and policies. But if you do have that authority, whatever you do, you can't go retroactive. Third, some of you have established new COVID-19 leave that some administrators, managers may have wiggle room to do it. Others, you may need to go your governing body. Again, we have less than a majority doing it, but some of you are doing it. Bottom line, be a new leave bank. Again, bottom line, generally paid leaves are negotiable with unions, but if you're just administering something and or your contract is silent on how leave is being used, generally you're not going to have to go to the unions and negotiate with them. Again, scour your contracts. Hopefully you don't restrict when leave can be used, even though a lot of you do for sick leave. But again, I think we all know it. We're all taking more liberal interpretations of what's an illness and injury or having to care for others in COVID-19. So some of you can administer, interpret it differently now, and that's going to be okay. It's just if you're establishing a new benefit or doing something directly contrary to the labor contract, we may have an issue with the unions. But again, we're not hearing much balking from the unions at this. So bottom line, if you do this, again, we've got model templates at the website at the end of this presentation. You should always do a notice to employees, put it in writing. Now, give your department head some discretion, but again, you as administrators or managers have to give your department heads clear discretion, or excuse me, clear guidance through a notice that goes to them and all employees. One, you articulate why. Again, we're back to in the balances of interest. If you've got a good business case to do it, generally you can do it. Two, make sure to clarify it's temporary. Three, put on the disclaimers. Look at this is not a contract. It supplements other policies. Other policies apply unless they're inconsistent with this notice. Put in the effective date. As I said, you can't make anything retroactive. That's a pretty black and white letter law in Minnesota. Even though Minnesota, under the what's called the public purpose doctrine, allows you to do things maybe otherwise couldn't in an emergency, we still don't think it gives you authority to ever go backwards and apply a new benefit going backwards. Talk about what are the conditions of using it, and talk about how they still can use their legally required leave. So again, we have template notice for this, but you should cover all of that in the notice and do it every time you establish something new and or you modify the notice in the future. Now, what's the fourth option? A lot of you doing remote work, also called telework. Again, bottom line, like we talked about, put in writing in a notice. Who's eligible for it on this slide? What are the parameters of when they can work? A big deal for hourly employees because you don't want them working overtime, likely. Three, whose equipment are you using? Generally require, I know we've had in the private sector, maybe more wiggle room to use personal equipment. Generally, we frown upon that in the public sector, though we know what happens. We know with smartphones and laptops, yes, it happens. We recognize reality. However, that causes a real concern if you're allowing employees to use personal laptops because of the fact that whenever they're doing work for you as a public employer, they're creating government data that's subject to the Data Practices Act and is also subject to your record retention law. So therefore, you need a mechanism. And three is it's subject to embedded within those laws is they have to safeguard and secure that data, and so to comply with data practices, to comply with record retention, and to safeguard and secure the data, it's a heck of a lot more difficult to do it with personal laptops. So we generally recommend, look at, if you got employees working from home, have them use city equipment. And again, you've got concerns obviously as an employer. Well, great, now they're using city equipment, bringing that home. Well, if we have these guidelines in place, remember, maybe generally you're more flexible than you have in the past. You're going to be better off, so we comply with those laws. Make sure the remote workplace is safe. I know some of you utilize checklists. I think that's a good idea. Are they reimbursed if they're using their personal printer for stuff? And the big deal, we're hitting a lot of clunkiness. How do employees record hours? Well, one, it's easy. Let's quickly talk telework. If they've got their laptop, they should be recording it electronically. Quick segue to that for timesheet issues. Again, put out a notice, clarify for employees whether it's got to be mail or drop off. You still got to have employees filling out their timesheets, especially public works folks are still, a lot of them are using it, hard copy manual. Send those home with them, get them to their place of home and put in guidance on how they should get the timesheets back to you, because we are hitting some clunky issue with our employers on that. So that's option 4. Now we get to 5. You got them in the workplace. Now let's stagger the work schedule. What does that mean? One is we've got clear guidance. We need people socially distanced. Generally, we can't have workers 6 feet together. Tough to do in public safety, tough to do in public works. So one of the best ways to do it is to, again, reduce the number of employees in each shift, but expand the number of shifts. And now we get it, especially in public safety, you're going to have overlap. So I know I'm oversimplifying a tough thing to administer, but from Team Legal's end, that's a fair enough definition of what are we talking about that, again, is good to make the workplace safe. So again, like anything else, do you have a management right to do this? So if you stagger work schedules, we want to be clear. The Supreme Court is clear in Minnesota, when a workday begins and ends, generally is a non-negotiable management right. But when we get to the next option, option 6, reduction of work hours, that's what might not be negotiable. On its face, contract aside, generally you get to dictate when days start and end. Now, what's the unfortunate reality? The unfortunate reality on this next slide for a lot of you is that, especially for public works, especially for public safety, you basically have provisions that, especially for public works, they work 7:30 to 4 every day or whatever time frame. So unfortunately, a lot of you have tied your hands on start and end times. Now, where we had a lot of arbitration in litigation nationwide during the Great Recession, on the issue of, usually it'll say the normal work schedule is, for example, 8 to 4:30. So we think if you follow a lot of these steps in this presentation, especially at the end, that we're going to modify the work schedule, contract aside, now put it in a notice, notify the union, discuss it with them, put that aside. We think generally if you've got the good faith business case to do it, and you notify the union, you can probably adjust schedules on a not abnormal basis. Your argument would be, and make sure when you do stagger work schedules, if you have this in your contract start and end times, that you clarify again in the notice, should be autopilot. Here's when it's effective, here's why we're doing it, and here's the end date. Because if you tell the union, we've got good reasons, and it's temporary and it's only prospective, generally you're going to get less likely them to balk at you staggering your work schedules. Now we're going to talk about in the next one, reduction in work schedule, what arguments unions can make on the economic end if you do it. So we have staggering, now we get to reduction. A reduction is this: we take your total work hours, let's take a ho-hum public works or clerical employee working 40 hours a week, we're running out of work, we've got social distancing issues, budget's tightening, we're going to shave you from 40 to 20 hours, at least in the meantime. So that's a reduction in work schedule. Not a furlough yet, because we're not sending them home and having them work zero. We're just reducing their work hours. So that's what this option is. Now, obviously, on its face, because we're taking you, for example, from 40 to 20 hours, generally you only get 20 hours of pay. Now, quick footnote on this, we'll talk about that economic issue and what you can do about it. With FLSA exempt employees, that is your salaried employees who meet one of the legal standards to be paid a salary, and they're not subject to minimum wage or overtime law. Generally, here's our example. Under FLSA, if they work 15 minutes in a work week, as a general proposition, you've got to pay them their full salary. So that's the general black letter law. You're going to be paying your FLSA exempt employees who have work at all, 15 minutes home or at work, their full salary. So keep that in mind. However, some of you may start to scour, well, we know we need to save money, and this is when budgets are going to be the issue, not workload with salaried employees. We can't afford to pay our mid-level manager for the full 40, at least in the interim. We're going to go to 20 to 30 a week. You can only get away with that in a corresponding reduction in salary if it's a bona fide reduction. Again, it's got to be due to an economic slowdown, which you're likely going to have good data, especially when MMB starts to release more of their stuff. And two is, it still doesn't go below the minimum salary amounts, which has recently been modified. And it's not your employer imposed salary, it's the legal minimum salary. So again, there's a lot more details in that one. We're not seeing much of that, but have that on your radar for FLSA exempt employees. Now, one thing you can do, you can say, look, we ran out of work, but we've got some budget. We're still going to pay you and make you whole for taking you, to our example, from 40 to 20. Here's how you can make up to get a full paycheck. Either one, you don't have to pay them, the hardline reduction. Two is place them on leave with pay, or a newly established COVID leave pay. Or three is you allow them to make up time with paid leave. Again, you're seeing a lot of you, per their survey, are doing it and have done that with reductions in work hours. But again, if you would take employees below 32 hours, as Chelsea articulated, that may trigger the right to get unemployment. Again, nuanced law, but always have that on your radar, what the cost will be. And also keep in mind, they still may be, even if we reduce a work schedule, yet their children's school is shuttered, they may still be allowed to utilize some of their emergency family medical leave or their emergency paid sick leave. So again, Chelsea went through that. And again, I know that gets nuanced. So again, when a workday begins and ends is not negotiable, but here's the problem. Under PELRA, generally you can't just unilaterally take somebody, the number of hours worked, and shave it from 40 to 20. Usually this is over a week time frame or per pay period that an arbitrator or court would look at. So again, shaving their total number of hours could cause a problem under case law and arbitral precedent. So again, look at your right to schedule work and look at the work hours. Now, a lot more you have total work hours employees will work. For example, a lot of you have the provision I can't stand, and law enforcement says, we're basically going to give you 2,080 hours of work year. So that's where the unions are going to start to utilize that provision. Now, again, you can monkey with schedules, start and end times, or maybe hours per shift. But again, if the unions start to sense per work week, per pay period, per month, or per year even, it results in you potentially reducing your hours, we could have a problem. Now, again, here's the problem. I think of all the things in the Great Recession, if you look at arbitration awards, this is where arbitrators were all over the place. So again, we're trying to position you well, but you got to do an analysis of your own contracts and take the steps we're talking about to at least position you well to potentially reduce work schedule. Again, end it by giving notice to employees. One thing you need to do an audit of what are we going to do with their fringe benefits if their hours are reduced? Are we prorating them? Are we wiping them off health insurance? Now, again, a lot of you have that in the policy. If you go below a certain threshold, below 30, you're off for health insurance, well, then they get COBRA. So think through those things. The other, beyond reduction in work hours, then we have furloughs. Bottom line says this, for a short period of time, maybe it's undefined, but you got to be clear it's short, you're going to be working no hours for a public employer. Again, we're seeing a lot that more in the private sector. Public sector, again, like anything else, we're slower to get there. Whether or not you want to get there is, of course, your option. But again, we'll likely see more of an uptick in furloughs. As I articulated, arbitrators are all over the place. But what can you do during a furlough? I think through April 30th even, you're going to see a lot more employers. One is you could say it's a hard furlough. You're out of work, you're out of money. So that is one option. The other are taking the option, well, because we're forced, because of us, we're not allowing you to work and make a paycheck. We'll just give you admin leave with pay. That's rare, but we are seeing some of that. Or the other option is, all right, during the furlough, you can exhaust your paid leave. Again, unions aren't happy about that. Employees aren't happy about that. But again, if they sense that you're not going to lay them off, you're probably just practically, and from a morale perspective, going to be better off than a layoff. But still, we are going to have unions are going to be challenging this. That is going to happen during the Great Recession. It will happen in the public. The issue is which one of the many of us are going to be the lab rat for that. But our job is to tell you, all right, what should you look at? How should you position yourself? Again, you can reduce costs. You may avoid payment of unemployment if you allow them to use paid leave. At least it keeps people employed and you can return them as you wish. It's less clunky than layoffs, and maybe it's better for morale. What's a con? Again, work isn't getting done. You got administrative headaches with benefits, with FLSA issues, and your other employees working, and of course, reduce morale. So again, now let's get to the hardline legal analysis. Let's scour your work schedule and your work hour provisions. Again, a lot of you thankfully probably have great management rights clauses on work schedules and hours. But again, first thing we're going to do, if you're talking furloughs or reduction in hours, we're going to say, let's look at the contract. Let's scour your work schedule and hours provision. I got to tell you, this is the toughest thing to do with a furlough is to talk black letter law. I think the better thing for you on this one, go right to your contract and look at practice, because that is going to be probably the most telling if you can unilaterally furlough, or do you need to meet, negotiate, and get union agreement. Now then we get to hiring freezes. That's look at if position is vacant, resignation, retirement, layoff, et cetera. Bottom line, we're not going to fill it. That's a hiring freeze. We're not seeing that as much now, but again, much like the Great Recession, we will see likely a lot more of it. Again, where does the negotiable issue? That's generally not negotiable. What could be negotiable is if a public works worker resigns and you have the public works supervisor get in the truck a lot more often. Well, then we're back to our analysis of an employee doing bargaining unit work, revert back to that analysis. Then we get to layoffs again. We're not seeing it at all, but I think it could be forthcoming, especially April 30th, after the state puts out its budget forecast. The governor does what he wants to do with the stay-at-home order, and where budget tightening and public scrutiny is probably going to enhance. Again, generally, unlike a furlough, generally layoffs are managed right. Now, but that doesn't do justice to what is likely in your labor contracts. A lot of you have tied your hands. Now, some of you have only tied your hands in process. So that means you still can do it, it's just you got to follow the process. Other you have tied your hands and said, for example, we can only lay off if there's an economic exigency, which you'll have, or other specific reasons. Those are where layoffs legally are going to be a lot tougher for those entities who've tied their hands, not on layoff process, but on the rationale you need to lay people off. So again, this is a loaded issue, causes the most heartburn among employees, you as management, elected officials. We get it's the most draconian, but again, something you all may need to look at if your budgets start to tank. Now, again, maybe during the Great Recession, we were looking at early retirement incentives. We're not seeing those yet, obviously, because a lot of us think, well, it's a short-term furlough, short-term layoff. Maybe that is real, but we don't know. Start thinking about that. We're not seeing much on the early retirement incentives, but if this is protracted, the budget and economic problems, we'll probably see a lot more of that. Bumping, a lot of you will see that. Basically, a more senior employee laid off can bump less senior. We got recall rights for employees if you refill a position. That could be an issue too if you have supervisors doing not bargaining unit work. And obviously, they'll clearly be eligible for unemployment. So now 4 minutes left. Bottom line, what do you do? If you got questions, feel free to chat and do the Q&A. We'll do our best to follow up. One, let's cobble up all our documents. When we're looking at all these options, let's put them in a nice electronic file for us. I know it sounds elementary, but Team Legal likes it. If you're challenged, well, then we can go to your one-stop file. And then the next document is the most important. What are you going to do before you do any of these? Let's look at the services we're providing, the functions we're performing, and the staff level and individual positions employees doing things. Two is, what are the options we've examined? What are the consequences of such? Why are we doing it? Again, articulating this in a nice notice that we try to give a template for at the end for our website. Then talk about how much money are we going to save and how more efficient are we going to be, and then end it with what's our process, including the timeline to implement. If you follow that flow for all your notices, all your memos, all your analysis, you're going to be, one, not only make a more informed decision, but two, position yourself well, especially if you're challenged by unions or in the rare case where an employees could make a discrimination claim, that the bottom line, you made it for good faith business reasons based on the circumstances. So try to autopilot these memos for you as administrators and have your department heads autopilot them, and then get your governing bodies more familiar with that flow. Then obviously discuss it with those who have power to make decisions, give appropriate notices. But here's the canned notice we give to unions on this, on furloughs or layoffs. We say, look, we're willing to talk things over with you, discuss, use that word. But by the way, we're still willing to meet, negotiate with you over anything that's negotiable. But generally we say, don't concede anything's negotiable, but you do have to say we're willing to negotiate things that are negotiable. And this gets back to a Sherburne County versus LELS case from 2005, which really lays out great framework for why we're saying this. So I'm not going to get in the weeds of that case, but again, that's the framework for our advice. Say we'll discuss it and say we're willing to negotiate if anything's negotiable, but don't concede anything is negotiable. Then when you're time for final decision, give your notice to employees, give notices to the unions. Now, what is going forward? Two things. One is we are going to have future webinars, again, a little more on an ad hoc basis based on circumstances. Per our CGMC Labor and Employee Relations Committee, we'll look at a panel discussion. We'll look at a more Q&A, which obviously we're running out of time in this one. We'll look at long-term, how should you budget for benefits? How are we going to negotiate? What are any new laws or challenges, and how to reorganize if we have long-term issues from COVID-19? And a good go-to site is a Coalition of Greater Minnesota City COVID-19 site, which not only has advice similar to this, but it has our survey and it has good workable tools for you. And unfortunately, we'll end it with our disingenuous time for Q&A. But in the 1 minute we have, again, I think for now, feel free to chat, feel free to email us. We'll follow up with all the questions asked of us, but we do appreciate all of you sitting through this webinar. We'll do it in the future, and we'll give you a notice, one, of future webinars, and two, we'd really like you to fill out our survey, and we will post the findings of that. So again, thanks to all of you. Plan well, notify unions and employees, and execute. So again, thank you to everybody. And the PowerPoint will be available to everybody online that we'll follow up with an email with. So feel free to share that with your supervisors, department heads, and your governing body. So again, thank you on behalf of the CGMC Labor and Employee Relations Committee.